The B-flat Quartet Opus 130 is the third of the three quartets which Prince Galitzin commissioned from Beethoven in 1822. Since Beethoven was still busy with the Ninth Symphony and the Missa Solemnis, he only got around to writing them in 1825. The results are the quartets Opus 127, 132 and 130. Apparently Beethoven still had a lot of musical material left over from composing those three works, leading to his composition of the C-sharp minor quartet Opus 131 immediately afterwards. There is a strong motivic connection between the latter three works. What is this connection? It is a four-tone motif that consists of two half steps. For example, the beginning of the A minor quartet Opus 132 sounds like this. The last of the three, C-sharp minor Opus 131, starts . Now, in the beginning of Opus 130, the work we are discussing today, the two half steps are right next to each other. Making it very unclear what tonality we're actually supposed to be in. Extremely prominent as a kind of apotheosis, the motif features in the Große Fuge or Great Fugue, the original last movement of this quartet. But we will talk about and play the fugue separately next week. Now let's look at the bigger structure of these works. In 127, Beethoven sticks with the classical four-movement plan. In the following quartets, he experiments with different concepts. Opus 132 has 5 movements, Opus 130 6, and Opus 131 even 7 shorter ones. Let's look at the movements of this quartet in B-flat, Opus 130, in more detail. It starts with an adagio non troppo, acting as a slow introduction to the following allegro. The falling half step of the beginning 4 notes are answered with a rising one in the 4th bar, coming back to the tonic. This is extended by a rising sequence that leads us to the dominant. The cello starts a canon with repeated Fs and more rising half steps. At the third entrance of the canon, the first violin does not stay with the repeated Fs, but leaps up a fourth, thus preparing the fanfare-like ascending fourth motif of the allegro. A very striking thing happens at the transition into the second theme group. The whole quartet ascends in unison in a chromatic scale, like a ladder to an undiscovered attic, and leads us to D-flat, from where the cello meanders down to G-flat major, the tonality of the second subject. If we look closer at the intervals of that gesture, we find that it actually stems from the opening motif. The exposition ends with a unison passage in G-flat, which foreshadows a passage in the G-flat section of the Große Fuge. The second time, this ending turns to G-flat F, and we start the development section with the adagio transposed to G-flat major, the leading voice this time in the cello. The tentative little allegro answer is already enharmonically switched to F sharp major. This allows us to sink a third down to D major, a completely different atmosphere from anything before in the piece. Our ascending and falling half steps become an ostinato, used as a backdrop to a gentle dialogue between the fanfare motif, this time from far away, and a new lyric gesture in the cello. The development section is very short and without much developing or drama. We fall in fifths from D to G, C, F, back to B flat, and slide into the recapitulation. The second movement comes as a type of scherzo, a fleeting presto in B flat minor. With a rather rough trio section. At the transition back to the main part, the first violin hangs in the air for a moment, then descends with a kind of eerie sigh, to be rudely interrupted by unison knocking in forte. The following movement, titled Poco Scherzoso, is marked andante con moto ma non troppo and set in D flat major. The movement starts dramatically, continuing in B flat minor, the key of the previous presto, and invoking the falling half step B flat A from the beginning of the piece. In the second bar, he adds another half step to A flat, thus turning us towards D flat major. Suddenly, we find ourselves in a completely different scene, one full of charm, subtle humor, and unexpected turns. After a presto scherzo and this semi-slow andante, we would be ready in the classical form for the finale. Instead, Beethoven extends the piece here with two more movements, as if building enough weight to counterbalance the enormous original finale, the grosse Fuge. So, rather surprisingly, we go to a kind of intermezzo called Alla danza tedesca and marked Allegro assai. This so-called German dance has something very simple about it, almost childlike. Was it not for the subtle dynamics Beethoven adds, which make us feel slightly drunk or out of focus? Subsequently, falling down a third to E flat major, we come to the slow movement, the Cavatina, one of the most intimate and touching movements Beethoven ever wrote. Alfred Brendel says, "Here the first violin has the chance of telling itself a secret." Let me just mention the incredibly mysterious middle section of this movement. The lower strings sink from an E flat pedal down a third to C flat major. The first violin enters, trying to tell us something so emotionally charged that speech is no longer possible, only stuttering. And finally, in Beethoven's original conception, there comes the große Fuge, the great fugue, the monumental last movement. But this we will talk about and play for you separately next week.